I have an admission that I am not here because of my passion for psychedelics. I am here because I'm actually here because of the ongoing tragedy of the overdose crisis. And I grew up about an hour north on a farm in a small town in New Hampshire and recently went back and visited and talked to a friend who had gone back through his high school yearbook. He's a couple years older than me, and noted that half of the men in his graduating class were now dead from drug overdoses or alcohol. And what got me into this work initially was that I had an experience almost 15 years ago now. I was hospitalized for several months. They thought I was going to die. They put me on levels of opioid pain medication normally reserved for people at the end of life. I dropped down about 50 pounds from where I am right now. And I ended up writing a book about this experience because when I went home, I kept learning that my friends who I played t-ball with were dead. And in that process, I wrote about my own journey. And I wrote in this book about this analogy of Ezekiel and the dry bones. And how when I had looked at myself and my skeletal frame in the mirror, I had felt this connection and felt as God was saying, speak, and there can be new life. There can be breath in these lungs again. And what I didn't put in that book, and I actually haven't shared publicly until today, now that I'm here with a few hundred of my closest friends and all of our folks on live stream, is that was not an analogy I came up with for the book. It was a visionary, ecstatic experience I had when I had taken far more pain pills than I should have one day. And that I looked back on that moment as a key spiritual turning point for me that gave me the motivation, direction, and encouragement that I needed, that I did not end up needing inpatient treatment for my own struggle with these opioids. And now, this was a difficult experience. It's hard to talk about psychedelics, which are spiritually oriented, but right now when the leading cause of death for those under the age of 45 is fentanyl-related overdoses, to say that you had a spiritual experience with fentanyl and hydromorphone becomes even more problematic. It was something that I didn't know how to interpret myself, and I didn't want to risk sending the wrong message at a particularly difficult time in our history. But what I also realized as I dove back into our past, is that this really isn't such an odd idea and might only have become odd after the rise of industrialization, our disconnection from our agrarian roots, and the professionalization of medicine. Because if you look back at Charles Spurgeon, right, this guy was the Billy Graham of his day, well known across the world in the 19th century. He actually wrote a sermon because he had heard about all of these folks who were having visions of heaven and dreams of Jesus, and they thought it was necessary and sufficient for salvation, and he was highly concerned. And he said, now if that was so, the sooner we all begin to eat opium, the better, because there is nothing that makes people dream so much as that. And the best advice I could give would be, let every minister distribute opium very largely, and then his people would all dream themselves into heaven. Now, he was kind of mixed about his opinions on opium. And one day he gave another sermon in which he said the Christian life is not like these experiences taking opium. He said, instead, the sleep of a Christian when he falls into this state is rather like the sleep produced by henbane. It is a kind of uneasy, short, disturbing, unreeling rest. It does a man little harm compared with the other, and his constitution recovers from the shock much more readily. And so what we're looking at is just in the 19th century, one of the most famous preachers in the world was dealing with the fact that people were having regular opium dreams of Jesus and painting it with significant religious and spiritual import. And then he says, no, you've got it wrong. Let's take henbane, which is classified as a hallucinogen. So what I would argue is it's very difficult to establish a psychedelic history of Christianity, probably maybe impossible. But I would say that one of the shifts that we have had culturally is that before drugs were understood scientifically, they were described spiritually. And that this actually makes a lot of sense from what we know about the evolutionary origins of religion or our tendencies towards religious impulses. So if we're looking at this field of neurotheology and those who are diving into cognitive tendencies that might have given rise to the religious impulse, we see a few fun things pop up. The academic terms, we've got hyperactive agency detection. We also have hyperactive understanding of intentionality, which are two fancy ways of saying that if we hear something go bump in the night, our first reaction is to assume there was an agent behind the bump, and that agent has an intention, and that's why we get worried. A couple more is we have hyperactive teleofunctional reasoning, which means that we tend to see things as having a specific purpose when we find them in our environments, and often assume that they had some sort of design. We also understand that we have theory of mind, in which we posit that other agents that we meet have a mind much like ourselves. And so I have often wondered, what was it like the first time one of our ancestors opened up an opium poppy and ate the sticky sap and the seeds that were inside? Well, it was an experience that might have been definitely new, but also somewhat familiar, because we also know that the opium poppy acts on our opioid receptors, which exist because of our naturally occurring endorphins, which bond us together in intimacy and create for us an experience of love. And so this ancient human, based upon these cognitive tendencies, might very well have said that this poppy that I am eating, there is agency, I assume an intentionality, I assume that it is here for a purpose, and I assume that is what behind all of these things that make me feel different inside and see the world differently. They have all of these things. And so what we would see in something like Plants of the Gods that we had that map of before is borne out in the historical record, that time and time again, in various different ways, people who encounter plants that make them feel differently inside begin to use language like, the spirit of this plant is in me, it is upon me, it possesses me. And so it makes a lot of sense that at some point, every plant that was encountered that made people feel differently was described in spiritual terms. Now, the title of my talk is Natural Law on Drugs, and so now I want to get to the natural law part. We know that there are cognitive tendencies that would give us this reason to believe that we are consuming agents with intention. And I came across a paper that was about, it was a natural law evaluation of the morality of overdose prevention centers or supervised injection sites. And the authors of this paper said, actually, we don't need to look at the efficacy of an overdose prevention center or the outcomes. We don't need to look at the context in which this policy might be implemented. And we don't need to look at the intentions of the people who are doing it, because we believe from a natural law perspective, the use of recreational illicit drugs is an intrinsic evil. And an intrinsic evil is always bad, no matter the context or the intent of the action. And so to make it less safe is to participate in evil, and therefore we should not have overdose prevention centers. Now, an intrinsic evil in the natural law tradition, there's a few other examples you can throw out there, are slavery and genocide. And so when we create the object of this act, the use of an illegal substance, as intrinsically evil, something else occurs. Is anyone who is interested in doing that act becomes someone who desires something that is intrinsically evil, and therefore is automatically morally suspect from the start. And I raise this example from the natural law tradition, not because I believe it is such an aberration, but because I believe they say explicitly what the dominant mode of thought is in our country today. that we have a certain natural category of illicit drugs that are illegal in all circumstances, in all reasons, for all times, and therefore they must be immoral to use at any time for any reason. And so when we are talking about any of these substances, we are not just going out against that explicit theological teaching. I would also argue that we are still running up against these old cognitive biases. As we've talked, there's a lot of discussion about the disenchantment of the world. And in some ways, I think we can see ways that enchantment certainly has changed and gone into different forms. But the primary mode that I think enchantment has gone into in our culture today when it comes to drugs that are currently illegal is that they have become demonized. And so you see in any public descriptions of addiction, you see it in the overdose crisis, suddenly fentanyl is not an inert chemical, but it is imbued with characteristics of an active agent with bad intent towards all of us. Doctors are now running into the issue that fentanyl is used all the time in medical settings, and patients get worried about it because they believe it has an inherent morally degrading effect. And so at the end of my time here, I'd like to just point out towards where did this come from? And that is why I am so concerned about my own Episcopal Church. Is before there was Nixon and the war on drugs, the first ever international conference on narcotics was chaired by Bishop Charles Henry Brent. And he brought together countries from across the globe. And at a time when there were many competing models for how to regulate drugs in our country and across the world, he said this: we must declare a war of extermination. We cannot compromise with a curse. And so what we have today is a system that believes we cannot make a compromise with a curse. And what I hope we can move towards is to an understanding that we are dealing with a sacred fire that can both warm and harm, and that is our inheritance.